Here is a 4,000-word script written in a natural, flowing human voice. No headings, no bullet points, just straight narrative. Let's talk about what is really happening with King Charles right now, because the story that most people are getting, fed through mainstream headlines, is barely scratching the surface of what is actually going on. We are days away from one of the most politically loaded royal visits in modern British history, and the pressure building around this trip to America is unlike anything the monarchy has faced in a very long time. So sit down, because this is going to take a minute to unpack properly. King Charles III and Queen Camilla are heading to the United States in late April, a visit that Buckingham Palace confirmed just days ago, framed publicly as a celebration of the 250th anniversary of American independence. On paper, that sounds wonderful. Two great allies, a historic milestone, a king and a president sharing the world stage for a moment of ceremonial grandeur. But the moment you peel back the surface of that framing, you find something far more complicated, far more tense, and, honestly, far more interesting than the palace would ever want you to know. This visit is happening despite calls from people on both sides of the Atlantic to cancel it entirely, driven by the fallout from Donald Trump's repeated criticism of the British government for failing to support the war in Iran. That right there is the geopolitical earthquake that is cracking the foundations beneath this royal tour. And it is impossible to understand the full weight of what Charles is walking into without understanding what has been going on between Washington and London over the past several months. Trump went to war, or at least the United States did, and Britain refused to show up in the way America wanted. The UK government denied the US's request to use British bases for offensive operations, leaving Trump visibly furious. Trump, who does not do quiet frustration, made his feelings known publicly. In a post on Truth Social, Trump said that countries who can't get jet fuel because of restrictions around the Strait of Hormuz should build up some delayed courage, go the strait and just take it. He went further than that too, calling out Prime Minister Keir Starmer directly and suggesting he was no Winston Churchill. For a British Prime Minister, that is not just an insult. It is a calculated humiliation delivered on the global stage by the most powerful man in the world. And the monarchy, whether it wants to be or not, has been pulled right into the middle of all of it. Now here is where it gets complicated in a way that most people do not fully understand, and this is crucial. Context. Britain is a constitutional monarchy, where the sovereign has no political power apart from that bestowed on him or her by the elected government. Everything Charles says is approved. The words are jointly crafted by him, his team, and government officials. Sir Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary, have a central role in every official royal communication. So when some newspaper runs a headline suggesting that the king privately sides with Trump on Iran, or that he would have handled things differently, that is not just wrong. It is a fundamental misreading of how the British system works. Charles does not get to have a foreign policy opinion. He does not get to freelance. He is, in constitutional terms, a vehicle for the elected government's diplomatic ambitions, and right now those ambitions are all about damage control. The decision to proceed with the visit may be seen as an effort by Starmer's government to ease the tensions caused by the war, or at least not inflame them. Think about that for a second. The king is being deployed, and that is the right word, deployed, to smooth over a rift between Washington and London that his own government helped create. He is not going to America because he particularly wants to be there amid all of this turbulence. He is going because Starmer needs him to go, because the special relationship needs to be publicly patched up, and because a 77-year-old constitutional monarch with cancer in his medical history is apparently the best diplomatic tool Britain has in its arsenal right now. The official announcement from the royal household read, on advice of His Majesty's government and at the invitation of the President of the United States, the King and Queen will undertake a state visit to the United States of America. It certainly did not say, I have decided to go. That language matters enormously. That is the palace being unusually transparent about the fact that this is a government operation wearing a crown, and yet almost nobody in the press is stopping to ask what it means for a monarch to be used this way during one of the most fraught diplomatic moments in the transatlantic relationship's recent history. It will be the first state visit by a British monarch since 2007, when Charles's mother, Queen Elizabeth II, was greeted by former President George W. Bush, nearly 2 decades since a British sovereign set foot in America on a formal state visit. That is a significant moment under any circumstances. But the timing of this one, landing in the middle of a war Britain refused to join, with a president who has publicly questioned British loyalty, with protests being organized across multiple countries, and with the shadow of the Prince Andrew Jeffrey Epstein scandal hanging over the royal family. This is not the triumphant transatlantic moment anyone had planned when the invitation was first discussed. The visit was confirmed by both Buckingham Palace and the White House, with Trump heralding the trip as a momentous occasion and planning to host a beautiful banquet dinner for the royal couple at the White House. Trump, to his credit, has consistently been warm about Charles personally. He has called Charles a beautiful man and a wonderful man, and before arriving in the UK for a state visit last year, referred to Charles as his friend. But there is a very real difference between Trump liking Charles as a person and Trump not being furious at the country Charles represents. Those two things can exist simultaneously, and they clearly do. The banquet will be magnificent. The photo opportunities will be stunning. And underneath all of that gilded ceremony, the actual diplomatic tension will still be there, unresolved, humming like a live wire. Congressional leaders have invited King Charles to address a joint meeting of Congress on April 28th, which would be the first such speech by a British monarch in 35 years. That is a remarkable honor, and under different circumstances, it would be the defining headline of the entire visit. But right now, it is almost an afterthought compared to everything else swirling around this trip. What is Charles going to say in that chamber? What do you say to a joint session of Congress when the country you represent just refused to back their military campaign? What do you say about the special relationship when that relationship is visibly, publicly fraying? Every word of that speech will be pored over, dissected, and potentially weaponized by people on all sides of this debate. Then there is the protest problem, and this is where the story gets even messier. Because it is not just one group of people who are angry about this visit, it is several completely different groups, all angry for completely different reasons, and together they are creating a convergence of opposition that is genuinely unprecedented for a British royal visit to America. Protests are already being planned by various groups. Some oppose British foreign policy, while others express solidarity with the Palestinian cause and view the visit as a demonstration of support for perceived US and UK policies in the region. Authorities are preparing for these demonstrations and are committed to ensuring the right to peaceful assembly while maintaining security. Law enforcement in Washington is already coordinating for a heightened security posture, and the scale of what is being anticipated is significant. But the protests are not just about Iran or Gaza. There is another layer here that has been building for months, and that hits much closer to home for the palace. The anti-monarchy group Republic has been growing louder and more aggressive in its campaign against Charles specifically, and the reason is Prince Andrew and his connections to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Anti-monarchy campaigners say their planned demonstrations will focus on questions surrounding Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and his past association with the late American sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. They want to know what Charles knew. They want to know when he knew it. And they are not letting go of that question just because a royal visit to America is inconvenient timing. Not our king. Graffiti was painted in bold red on the walls of St. Asaph Cathedral in Wales just hours before Charles and Camilla arrived for the royal Maundy service on April 2nd, requiring workers to scramble to remove it before the royals stepped out of their cars. Think about what that image represents. A cathedral wall. Easter week. Anti-monarchy slogans sprayed across a place of Christian worship literally hours before the King of England arrives to distribute Maundy money in a tradition stretching back to the year 600 AD. That is not just political protest. That is a visceral expression of something that runs very deep in how some people feel about this institution right now. A small group of protesters was spotted among the massive crowds of well-wishers who gathered outside the cathedral. They held yellow flags from Republic and were separated from the larger crowd using barriers. They also held a banner featuring images of King Charles, ex-Prince Andrew, and Prince William, alongside the message, "What are you hiding? Royal Epstein inquiry now." The Royal Observer. What are you hiding? That is the question being asked not just by activists with flags, but by politicians, by lawyers, by journalists on both sides of the Atlantic. Democratic Representative Ro Khanna of California has already formally requested a private meeting between the king and survivors of Epstein's abuse during the upcoming American visit. A meeting that, if it actually happened, would be extraordinary. And if it does not happen, will itself become a story. The U.S. Justice Department released 3.5 million more pages of Epstein files in late January, prompting renewed scrutiny of Andrew, formerly known as Prince Andrew, who has long faced questioning over his friendship with the disgraced financier. Time 3.5 million pages. That is a document dump of almost incomprehensible scale, and whatever is buried in those files has not yet been fully processed or reported on. Every day that passes, more journalists are going through that material. More names are potentially surfacing. More connections are potentially being drawn. And right in the middle of all of that, the King of England is about to fly to Washington and sit across from Donald Trump for a state dinner. Republic CEO Graham Smith said in a statement, "Charles shouldn't be able to avoid questions about his complicity in the Andrew scandal. The public wants answers. That's why activists were protesting in North Wales today." Yahoo! Complicity is a strong word. The palace would furiously reject it. But Smith is not using it carelessly. He is using it deliberately to force a conversation that the royal family has spent enormous energy trying to suppress. And Charles has, to be fair, taken some action on this. King Charles III's decision to strip Andrew's titles was seen as aimed at shielding the monarchy from scandal fallout. PBS, but stripping someone of their title is not the same as providing transparency, and protesters know the difference. Now add to all of this the warning that was issued months ago by American political strategist Steve Schmidt, and you begin to understand just how uniquely exposed Charles will be once he lands on American soil. Schmidt, during a podcast interview, said, "I have a message for the king. I'm involved in a group called the Save America movement. The king should not come to America in 2026. He warned that if the king steps foot on American soil in service of the MAGA movement as a propaganda tool, then the crown will be attacked with an advertising campaign that would not be permitted in England." Geo.tv. That is a direct, explicit, named threat from a significant political figure in American life. Not a fringe voice, not an anonymous source, but a man who ran John McCain's presidential campaign, warning the King of England that coming to America right now will mean a coordinated attack on the institution of the monarchy itself, using the freedoms of American political speech in ways that British law simply does not permit. Because here is something that matters enormously in this conversation and gets almost no coverage. Britain has laws that effectively shield the monarchy from certain types of public attack. America does not. The First Amendment is not a gentle guideline. It is an absolute protection, and it means that whatever advertising campaign, whatever protest materials, whatever commentary these groups want to put out about Charles, about Andrew, about the royal family's finances, or its colonial history, or its relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, all of that is fully protected in the United States in ways it simply would not be in the UK. Charles is about to step into a country where the rules he has lived under his entire life do not apply, and where the people who most want to damage the institution he represents have every legal right to do exactly that. Fortune magazine noted that the official announcement was closer to the actual date than is usual for such visits, suggesting a degree of delay given the geopolitical situation. This was not an invitation that was leapt at with enthusiasm. Fortune read that again slowly. An invitation to visit the White House, extended by a president who calls Charles his friend, was not leapt at with enthusiasm. That one sentence tells you everything about how the palace actually views this trip. They knew what they were walking into. They knew the Iran tensions were unresolved. They knew the Epstein files were dropping. They knew the protests were being organized. And they still had to go because not going was judged to be even more damaging than going. To not go in 2026 would have been a considerable diplomatic snub. Visits later in the year would have clashed with the World Cup and then the midterm elections in America and Remembrance Sunday in the UK. Fortune. There is the cold, calendar-driven logic behind the whole thing. Not poetry, not sentiment, not a king's burning desire to celebrate American democracy, just the brutal arithmetic of international diplomacy, where every option is terrible and you pick the one that is least terrible and you dress it up in gold and pageantry and hope that the optics outshine the substance. And Trump, for his part, has leaned into this with characteristic enthusiasm. Trump said, "I look forward to spending time with the king, whom I greatly respect. It will be terrific." PBS 5 exclamation points worth of enthusiasm for a man whose government has been publicly sniping at Britain for months. That is the peculiar nature of this whole situation. The personal warmth between Trump and Charles appears to be genuine, and yet the political relationship between their two countries is genuinely strained in ways that have not been publicly resolved. What you are watching, if you step back and look at all of these threads simultaneously, is something quite remarkable. A constitutional monarch with no personal political power is being deployed by his elected government to fix a diplomatic relationship damaged by decisions he had no part in making. He is going to a country where groups are waiting to confront him about his brother's connections to a dead sex offender. He is going to stand before a joint session of Congress and speak words that have been carefully approved by British civil servants and will be parsed by American politicians looking for any sign of favoritism or criticism. He is going to attend a state dinner hosted by a man who is simultaneously his friend and a vocal critic of his country's foreign policy. And he is going to do all of this while anti-monarchy graffiti is still being painted on cathedrals back home, and Republic activists are planning demonstrations in his wake. This is not a ceremonial pageant. This is a high-wire diplomatic act by a 77-year-old man carrying the institutional weight of an 100-year-old monarchy on his shoulders during one of the most turbulent moments in transatlantic relations in recent memory. The pomp is real. The carriages will be beautiful. The banquet at the White House will be spectacular. But underneath all of that, the crisis is just as real. And the people responsible for managing it are hoping very hard that the spectacle is dazzling enough to make you forget the questions that nobody in power actually wants to answer. And the really extraordinary thing? The visit is expected to aim to celebrate the historic connections and the modern bilateral relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. Time historic connections. There is a deep irony in a British monarch traveling to America to celebrate the anniversary of the revolution that threw off British rule, delivering a speech to Congress about the shared values of freedom and democracy, while protesters outside hold banners demanding answers about a royal family that has spent decades cultivating an image of untouchable dignity. History, as they say, has a sense of humor. Whether the king does too, we are about to find out.